these policy ideas that he's come up with when being interviewed are essentially sort of back of a bus ticket stuff, because a week ago he wasn't expecting to be a candidate for the leadership of the Liberal Party and to be the Prime Minister of Australia. I mean, we are really whittling back our time spent preparing for Prime Ministership in the incumbents that we think about placing in these roles. What it means is that if he were to become Prime Minister sometime after midday today, Peter Dutton would have not only a huge amount of policy work to formulate with whomever he appoints to the front bench, but also at the same time have to familiarise himself with the bulk of Australian voters who resolutely fail to identify him in a lineup.
Matthias Cormann says he's rock solid behind Peter Dutton because he's really impressed with his ability to win in this marginal seat of Dixon. He's got an ability to reach out to hard-working, aspirational families, and I guess that's the pitch that's going to happen in this meeting today. Do you think that's enough to get him over the line, Patricia and Barry?
Barry?
Well, I noticed one of those radio shock jocks in Sydney this morning suggested that Peter Dutton would pick up 5 seats in Victoria. I live in Victoria. I don't know what world that guy lives in.
Which 5 seats was there? That sounds. I would ask for some programmatic specificity on that particular estimate.
It would go the other way. They would be suddenly sandbagging 5 seats that they hold right at the moment.
Really interesting, because if you look at the push for Peter Dutton, for viewers who are not across who some of these faceless men might be, let me give you some faces. They're actually Victorians. So Michael Sukkar has been one of the people working very hard for Peter Dutton. We know that Jason Wood, a marginal seat holder in Latrobe, has also been, a supporter of Peter Dutton. So even though the mainstream thinking is, and Neil Mitchell, I think, really has been interviewing Peter Dutton in a very pointed way with those Victorian values in those questions, because we know Victoria is a bit more small L Liberal. I mean, it's a different place to Queensland. That's a fact if you look at voting patterns. But I think that it's interesting that we're looking at a situation where actually a lot of Victorian MPs, Alan Tudger's the other one, who are actually, putting
Sarah
their
Henderson
support.
doesn't share that view, and she's in the marginal seat of Coringa.
And also Julia Banks, who is, another one.
Right, we'd have to leave it there, Patricia and Barry, for now, because here's where we welcome listeners on ABC Radio to our live coverage of the leadership crisis. MPs across the Liberal Party are lobbying the Prime Minister for a party room meeting today, saying the instability of the leadership must be resolved.
And this morning, the Solicitor General has ruled leadership contender Peter Dutton is not incapable of sitting in Parliament. The Attorney General has released the 27 pages of advice about Mr Dutton's financial interests and whether he's in breach of the Constitution. The advice says Mr Dutton is not incapable of sitting in Parliament, but warns there are some risks and it's impossible to state his eligibility with certainty. Well, National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett and News Breakfast host Michael Rowland join us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Gentlemen, good morning to you both. First, just a recap of developments this morning.
Well, if you don't mind, Joe, I'm going to cease and desist from calling this place Parliament House for the next hour. It's the numerical nut house, if you don't mind, because it's numbers, counts, counter-counts, it's all flying around here. So we're hearing claims put out for obvious intent by the Dutton camp that they're comfortably ahead. We're hearing margins of 4 votes there. We're hearing from other people within that Dutton camp that we're a bit nervous here, we can't be certain. So, Michael, it's a mess.
It is a mess, and we're creeping ever closer to that midday timetable set down by the Prime Minister. I'm guessing that given everybody is in this numerical nut house, I love that expression, it won't take too much notice for the Prime Minister to call that party room meeting. I was just speaking to a Liberal senator with ties to the Dutton camp saying that there has to be a meeting today. There will be a meeting today. Whether it's at midday or a bit later, we'll find out, but things are still going crazy.
In a place that has lacked common sense for, well, at least 4 days now, probably much longer. That is the common sense conclusion that Michael's talking about there. The whole idea that midday might have passed us by and the Liberals don't enter the government party room here always seemed a bit far-fetched. So what we're seeing, Joe and Roz, is people, as we understand it, throwing their names on this petition. Warren Inch is one of them, publicly named now, purely as a mechanism, as a device to make sure that this meeting does go ahead.
And one of the critical events of the morning, Michael and Greg, there has been this advice from the Solicitor General on the eligibility or not of Peter Dutton to sit in the Parliament. We've had some glorious phrases as you've just been outlining. Let's go to Anne Toomey now, who's our constitutional law expert. You've had time to really drill down into this very complex and many-paged ruling, or advice at least. What's your take out from it?
OK, well, first to just defend the Solicitor General for mentioning about the phrase not incapable. It's not because he's phrasing things in a peculiar way. It's because the actual section of the Constitution that deals with disqualification deals with whether or not a person is incapable of being chosen. And so that's...
lawyers all sticking up. This is what happens.
That's where the word comes from. So when he's saying he's not incapable, he's saying that that section 44 he thinks doesn't apply. Having said that, it's a very qualified opinion. So it's qualified in a number of ways. First, in relation to the facts, he says, well, I don't have all the documents. I've actually been given very little to support this. I don't have a copy of the trust deed. I don't know a lot about the relationship between the particular childcare centres and the government. So if I got more information, maybe this would be different.
Do you reckon there would have been a bit of language last night when the Solicitor General received this ticking time bomb in his in-tray?
Well, it's the job of Solicitor General is to receive ticking time bombs. I mean, you might remember that from Justin Gleeson's time as Solicitor General, and in fact he threw a few of his own as well.
Does anyone ever want that job? It just seems like the worst job ever.
It's certainly a high-stress job. It's definitely a high-stress job, but it's actually one of the most interesting, at least in my view anyway, in government. So.
And you've said he would have been considering this for quite some time.
Indeed. Well, in fact, I was the one who tipped him off with the problem last Monday night, because we both happened to be at the same academic seminar that he was giving a paper on, and afterwards I told him about the that the news had broken on Channel 10 about the disqualification
Wasn't it
issue.
ABC?
No, unfortunately. Nonetheless, so yes, so Stephen's known about this since Monday of last week. He would have thought about it, because it would be obvious at some stage or another this issue was going to come to him. The main impediment that he had, along with everybody else, is the lack of information. So it's quite difficult to advise on things if you don't have sufficient facts. Having said that, what he has done is done an analysis of the current legislation. Now that's really important, because all the other advisors dealt with the previous version. It changed from July this year, so we've now got an analysis of the current legislation. Looking at that, he takes the view that there's not an agreement. He's probably right.
When you say not an agreement, for people who aren't familiar with the details of this, outline what an agreement is.
Not an agreement with the public service. And so the disqualification provision says if you have a direct or an indirect pecuniary interest in an agreement with the public service, then you're disqualified. So the idea of the provision is to stop members of parliament being influenced by government, luring them with, lucrative contracts, and also to stop members of parliament themselves sort of trying to influence the government by saying, you should give me good contracts because then I might vote for you. So none of that actually applies in relation to the Dutton issue, so that's sort of, let's park that to the side. But when the High Court addressed this in 2017, what they also looked at was the issue of potential conflict of interest. So the issue here is whether or not the fact that you receive money from the government through some sort of an agreement is enough to potentially influence you so that you prefer your own private interests to the public interest. And that's the thing that really agitated the High Court last time. And the High Court was quite strong on the idea that this provision is in the Constitution to protect the people. It's there to protect the public interest and to make sure that politicians are solely acting in the public interest. So that's the relevant test. The Solicitor General here notes that very large amounts of money were flowing to these childcare centres. We're talking about millions of dollars. So if there was an agreement with the public service, that fact that there are millions of dollars in issue could then activate that test about, whether or not there's a conflict of interest. But he says, regardless of that, the fact that there's millions of dollars, he didn't think that there was that initial issue of whether or not there is actually an agreement with the public service to trigger the provision.
And Tumi, thanks so much for that. Let's go back to Melbourne now. Patricia Carvelis, you have some information about this petition that we've all been waiting for.
So we've got this meeting at midday, this meeting that can only happen, according to the Prime Minister, if this petition is handed to him with 43 signatures. The petition is not being handed over. It hasn't been received. The Prime Minister hasn't received it. They believe that the Dutton supporters don't intend to hand it over. I'm trying to get clarity from the Peter Dutton supporters about why they wouldn't hand it over if they have those signatures. Yeah. Annabelle, I can only tell you what I'm hearing.
Sure,
and I know it's odd, people.
I don't disbelieve any of it. I mean, seriously.
It's if viewers are watching thinking, that seems odd, are they adults or children? No, they are adults, and I don't know. It's so bizarre that we are 50 minutes away from a meeting and we don't have a petition which meets the Prime Minister's conditions. We have a Prime Minister who has not changed those conditions, but everyone expects to turn up to a meeting at midday.